Here we are, Real Recovery Talk. I am your host, Tom Conrad. In today's episode, we've got Benjamin B.
What's happening, everybody?
First things first, thank you for tuning in to the podcast app, whichever one that is that you use. And thank you for watching on YouTube. And just thank you in general. If in the end you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you could always reach out to us, Tom at realrecoverytalk.com. And Ben at realrecoverytalk.com. We will get back to you momentarily, right, Ben?
Yes, we will.
All right. In this episode, we are going to continue our series on the 12 steps, and today we are progressing into step number 2. If you remember correctly, one of the previous episodes, we covered a little bit of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and step 1, and then today we want to cover step 2. So let's just jump right into it, Ben. Tell us what step 2 is, and then we'll go from there.
All right. I'm going to do the same thing real quick that we did last time, but I won't go into as much depth with saying Tom and I do not represent AA or 12-step programs as a whole. This is simply my experience, Tom's experience, and specifically for me with getting a sponsor and having a sponsor break down the big book for me. And step 2, so let's just jump right into it. Step 2 says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So I like doing like some Mythbuster stuff because I've been around the rooms long enough, over 12 years. Well, definitely longer than 12 years if you count the times I didn't get sober as well. I've probably been bouncing in and out of the rooms of AA for 20 years probably. I think I went to my first meeting at 20 years old. Yeah.
I don't know.
19 years, something like that. Yeah. But and this is part of my story as well, one of the things that people struggle with a lot is this idea that like a power greater than them. The big book uses the word God. If you look up at the walls in AA, the 12 steps, we discussed it last time. It's like a snapshot of what the steps are. And again, we use the analogy, reading the steps up on the wall is like reading the table of contents of a book and assuming that you know the book. And Tom and I mentioned the context behind it, and there's a lot more to it than just came to believe a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So one of the things that I really struggled with was that there was some sort of God that was going to get me sober. Because in my mind, like, if there was a God, I wouldn't be a junkie to begin with. There wouldn't be world hunger. There wouldn't be wars, etc. I had a real problem with that. Why so much misery in the world? But here's the thing. God gave us free will as human beings. I'll get into that in later steps. But why is it I had to come to believe a power greater than me could restore me to sanity? And I think it's important to commence at a simple level. Whether you're quote-unquote a religious person, not a religious person, whether you want something to do with God, not to do with God. The awesome thing about Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs is we don't tell you what to believe in, we just tell you to believe. So I want to point it out, another part of AA, the founders were Christians. They made one heck of an effort to leave Christianity and any of their beliefs out of the big book, so that people could take their own beliefs and formulate what they needed for them. I think it's really important to hit that home. But came to believe a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The first thing I like to point out is that restore us to sanity, the steps are politely telling us we're acting insane, right? I mean, look at people's, what's the word I'm looking for, patterns within their addiction and all the insane behaviors we partake in, things that go against our morals, our philosophies. I believed I was a good person, but then at the same time I was doing things that I knew in my heart were wrong just to be able to get my drink or drug.
Yeah, let me pause you there because I think this is a good place to just give an analogy of that. And I'll use my own experience in terms of the insanity of it. We oftentimes, as an alcoholic, as a drug addict, I can't tell you how many times I said, well, tomorrow I'm going to stop. And tomorrow comes, and of course, I don't stop. And lo and behold, the longer that my alcoholism stayed the way that it was, the worse that it got, the worse things that I did, even though me, myself, as a person, and I know this, I'm a good person at heart because when I'm sober, I'm a good person. I compromised on my ethics. I compromised on my morals. I compromised on everything just to be able to sustain my alcoholism and my drug addiction. So I think what part of what this is saying in step 2, restore us to sanity, the way that we were acting in our addictions was kind of insane, because when you put some sober time together and you start drawing some sober breaths, you're not that insane of a person. And there's people that do get sober, though, that are miserable, that could be even more insane. But I think there's something to do with, maybe they're not, I don't know, how would you describe this, Ben? Somebody that gets clean and sober, that's more miserable sober than they are when they're drinking. My analogy of them is they're just dry. They've just put down the drink. They've just put down the drug. They haven't done any sort of internal work. They haven't really done anything. All they've done is put the plug in the jug and they've stopped drinking. Well, those types of people, chances are they're not going through this process, because if you go through this process in the way that it's laid out, it's nothing. It has little to do with drugs and alcohol, and everything to do with life and how we live it.
No, exactly. So to answer your question, like, I'd rather touch more like on the process that you just talked about.
Sure, yeah.
The 12 steps lay out a process. So what I saw when I walk into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, I see the word God. And me, I panicked. Like I said before, if there was a God, he certainly hadn't done anything for me. I was pissed. However, what I did see was I had a sponsor who was clearly living his life happy, joyous, and free. There was something about him. When he walked into the rooms, he was smiling ear to ear. When he spoke, everybody laughed at everything he had to say. He literally, he pissed me off. Just the way he presented, because I'm like, how could this guy be so happy? So what I succumbed to at the time was more, when it says a power greater than ourselves, I'd switch that word power in a way to the word process. Like, if I follow these steps from a psychological perspective, will I be able to achieve sobriety? I didn't turn I'm speaking solely for myself. I didn't turn myself over to a God. I turned myself over to a process, because there is a part in the big book too, and this is all part of step 2. I'm a little overwhelmed with the amount of information bouncing around my head and being able to get it out in 30 minutes here. But there's a part in the big book that's part of step 2. It tells us that recovery from alcoholism starts with a personality change sufficient to overcome our alcoholism. So what I could grasp onto is I needed a personality change. My sponsor said, Ben, you don't have a drinking problem. You have a personality problem, dude. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So that was a launching off point for me. And he would say, so step 2 in the big book specifically says, we need to ask ourselves one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, there's a power greater than myself? And let me just call it what it is. Again, like, if you come into the rooms and you're part of a religious denomination, that's great. Run with that. If you're a guy like me that comes in and you want nothing to do with religion or God, all you have to do is have a willingness to believe that there's something greater than you. And let me break it down in the most simple way possible. You hear this example in the rooms all the time. It's super elementary, but it makes sense. If you go to the beach and a wave is coming, put your arms out and stop that wave. You can't do it. That wave is a power greater than you. You're simply acknowledging that you're not God. You don't have the power to control everything in the world. And that is all you need to get started. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think another thing that let's touch on this just real quick. inside the rooms too, people that struggle with the idea of the God concept, you oftentimes hear about, well, use us, use the people in the room. What do you say to that?
So there's again, I love quoting the big book, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have time to go through it all exactly. But there's God is either everything or else he is nothing. So essentially when I first heard that, I thought that meant like he has to mean everything to me. But through time, like and seeking more understanding, what I saw is God is either everything or else he is nothing. I believed that a power greater than me was the people in the rooms. There's what's that? GOD, group of drunks, or good orderly direction. So I believed, and this is something I could grasp, that God, spirit of the universe, whatever you want to call it, destiny, would put people in my life at a time when I needed them. When I needed, it's funny, like I could look back at the events in my life, and certain people would enter my life when I needed to hear what they had to say, and then maybe later down the line they're no longer there, if that makes sense. Like certain people would come into my life at certain times. So I do believe, for me, that the God of my understanding, spirit of the universe, I like to refer to it as, puts people in my life that I need to hear something from, or watch them and watch their example and how they move through life. And hence, I'll break it down like this. God speaks to me through other people. God is everything or else he is nothing. Because I'll hear people sometimes talk about, well, the fellowship and people aren't enough to get you sober. I agree with that. But this whole thing isn't black and white. You know, faith without works is dead is another line in the big book. We have to do the work. We have to take the action. We have to be seeking. It's that simple. And I want to hit you with something, Tom. My sponsor said to me at one point, because he knew I didn't want anything to do with the God stuff. He said to me, I'll just ask you, Tom, do you believe I have a God that works for me?
Sure.
And I'd say, I do. Now, could you answer that question any differently?
Well, I could have said I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. But the point is if you like think about it analytically, there's no way you can argue my personal belief.
Right.
And I want to give, oh man, God, this stuff is just bouncing around my head. Like I'm kind of word vomiting at this point. I want to give another example for people that struggle with the God thing as well. You know, to sum that part up though, my sponsor said, just believe that I believe.
Yeah.
You know, but I want to give an example too. Tom, name somebody you love.
My wife.
My wife. Prove it to me.
Well, I mean, that's kind of weird.
Prove it to me.
You'd have to like come over to my house and stuff.
And what would you do to prove it to me?
Now it's getting really weird. No, I see what you're saying there. I mean, love it's more of an emotion.
Like,
right?
And there's no rhyme or reason behind it. If you really dig deep, think about it. So I'll tell you what I said to my sponsor. My sponsor asked me that question. He said, Ben, who's somebody you love? I said, my son. And he told me to prove it to him. And I was, I'm newly sober. My brain's not really working too well. I'm like, well, I take care of him on Christmas. And I buy him nice things. And I take him to the park. And I make sure that I tell him I love him. He's like, Ben, you could do all those things to manipulate your way to getting heroin. I'm like, so he's like, so that doesn't prove anything to me. I don't know your motives. But then he said to me, he's like, basically along the lines of like, he asked, will I ever be able to convince you that you don't love your son? I'm like, yeah, dude, I love my son. Like, you're never going to be able to convince me otherwise. And his point was there was no tangible proof that I could show to another human being to prove my love. It was something I had in my heart with no way of proving it. There's no way for me to know whether Tom loves Amanda or not, his wife.
That's true. Yeah.
I just kind of got to take his word for it. I guess she does too.
Yeah.
I don't know if I hope Amanda's listening or not listening.
She listened to the last one, so I'm sure she's going to listen to this one.
But the point is if my sponsor would, and this was using a chapter out of the big book, Chapter of the Agnostic, it has this example in there in these sentences. He's just elaborated on it for me. If something like love can exist in your heart without any proof to the outside world, why couldn't there be a power greater than you, a God, a spirit of the universe, something along those lines? Why does everything alcoholics and drug addicts have a tendency to want proof for everything?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and that's where a lot of people get hemmed up is the tangible evidence, And then, but I even look at myself, and a lot of the stuff that you're saying comes with time, I think. It's, you've got a lot of years under your belt. I'm looking at your big book right now. It's marked up to no end. I mean, what's that say?
It says 2020 hindsight.
Yeah, 2020 hindsight. Yeah. So point is, fast forward now, almost 13 years sober. Hindsight's 2020.
So the whole thing, and I can basically, in a way, sum up my step 2, is that I said to myself, what do I have to lose? Heck, I could even say, I'm going to finish these steps to prove to my sponsor that this doesn't work. It was me simply having the willingness to go through with the process. And Eric, who works with us, always says the best way to finish a step is to do the next one. So I didn't even necessarily, in all honesty, I just mentioned the 2020 hindsight thing because one thing that changed about me in recovery and early recovery was I quit asking why. See, as a drug addict and alcoholic that's stubborn, self-centered, and selfish, if you ask me to do something, I jump right to, what am I going to get out of it? And my sponsor literally looked at me and said, I'm like, what am I going to get out of doing these 12 steps? He said, I don't know. He said, I know what happened to me. I don't know what's going to happen to you, Ben. But that simply, in my example, too, of asking you about whether or not you love your wife, Amanda, is simply trying to get you to start thinking a little bit more open-minded at the possibility. And let me hit this home too. And this is my opinion. Hopefully it's not taken in bad taste based off of my experience. One thing that drives me crazy, because my sponsor taught me to go by exactly what the big book says to the best of my ability. Sometimes I hear in the rooms, steps 2 and 3 kind of go together in a way, but step 3 is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over the care of God as we understood Him. Sometimes through working with our clients and working with people that have had previous sponsors, they'll tell me their sponsor didn't let them move on to the 4th step because they didn't find God yet. That is the biggest nonsense I've ever heard. It's a 12-step program. And I'll just throw it out there now. We'll get there in more detail when we get to this step, but I didn't find a higher power, so to speak, a purpose until step 12. It took me all 12 steps to start to be able to conceptualize what the 12 steps meant to me. How is somebody supposed to do that in the first 3? Could it happen? Yes. I know people like that. I know people who have done steps 2 and 3 and they had like a white light experience. That wasn't my experience. But people try to sponsor sometimes, in my opinion, try to dictate where or what beliefs someone has to have. And I reiterate, the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous made a huge effort to not dictate and not tell somebody what they believe. The book, it even says in there, the book is meant to be suggestive only. And so much of what Bill W. talks about in the big book is just to get the wheels turning. Let me touch on another analogy that comes out of the big book as well. Remind me if I've already touched on this one before. Say, for instance, I move into a new town. I'm new to the area. My car breaks down, right? I need a mechanic. Tom's my new neighbor. who's been living in this town for his whole life, 39 years. Tom might know a good mechanic, right? He might have a solution to my problem. I go knock on my new neighbor Tom's door. I say, Tom, do you know a mechanic locally that can do a good job and give me a fair price?
Sure.
Okay. So Tom tells me what mechanic to go to in town. I drive my car down there. I go to that mechanic. That mechanic does exactly what Tom said. He gave me a fair price. He did a good job. My car's up and running. A year down the road, I need a mechanic again. Do I go back to Tom and knock on his door and say, hey, Tom, do you know a good mechanic?
No, you go straight to the mechanic.
I go straight to the mechanic. Here's the thing. Came to believe. There's a difference between coming to believe, and having faith. The first time, all I did was believe Tom. I believe that Tom knows a mechanic, and I'm going to try this out. By going to that mechanic and experiencing that mechanic's work and his prices, I now have faith in that mechanic. I go straight back to the source. That is what step 2 is all about. It's only the part of me going to ask Tom. That's step 2. I went to my sponsor and said, dude, my life is totally jacked up. I don't know what to do about it. You say that you know these 12 steps and you've had an experience with them, and you haven't picked up a drink in X amount of years or drug. What's this all about? That is a starting point. That's it. I'll tell you today, I still consider myself agnostic, which means I haven't necessarily, like, quote unquote chosen a God, if you will. Agnostic, Gnostic means knowledge. If you put the Latin root ag in front of it, it means without. So it means there's a chapter in the book called We Agnostics. So it translates to we without knowledge. It's for people just like me who either don't have a concept of God, don't want a concept of God, maybe they're atheists. So the big book was literally written for people also who can be atheists. Over half of the fellowship of the first original 100 members were atheists or agnostics, 50 out of 100 of them. So this idea that, in my opinion, is what keeps people from finding a solution in 12-step programs, is they think they know what the program's about. They read the table of contents, but they didn't get the context behind it. They weren't taken through the book with the sponsor that can show them that the big book is simply trying to get you to develop your own experience. Does that make sense?
That makes really a lot of perfect sense. Yeah. I don't know that it's necessary that we even do any more.
No.
Honestly, I don't think so, because I think that you ended it well there, because if we try and do anything more, then there's no sense in getting into the weeds.
Yeah,
I think you broke that down pretty good.
I'm with you there. And I reiterate, like, keep in mind what we're doing on this podcast is a very small snapshot. When I have what my sponsor did with me, when I have a sponsee, keep in mind, I'm sitting down with them and generally reading the big book for an hour and a half at a time, a bunch of times, and like getting into this stuff. And you just simply want to spark the idea in somebody's mind that you're not God and you can't control everything.
Yeah, I've used this analogy with people before. It's the 30,000 foot view. And it's kind of like your table of contents thing. You know, you fly 30,000 foot over New York City, you definitely can tell that there's a city there. You know, you can see where Central Park is. You know, especially you fly in at night, you see it's just a big blob of lights. But it's not until you land, you get off the airplane, and you start exploring, do you see what all the city has to offer. And that's kind of where we're at here. You can take this step, came to believe in a higher power, that a higher power would restore us to sanity, and leave it at that. That's a 30,000 foot view. And until you actually get involved and get kind of into the weeds of it and have an open mind and be willing to explore that step, you really start to see the benefits. But a lot of times it's the analysis by paralysis type thing, or paralysis of analysis, however it goes.
They call it analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You get so ingrained, because I know people, they've seen the words higher power and they're like, nope, they ain't going to do it.
I want to share one more thing with you on the opposite end of the spectrum, because maybe there's some listeners that do believe in God. Maybe they belong to a religious denomination. And again, hopefully this is not taken in bad taste, but this is my personal experience. At this point, I've sponsored, I don't know, probably in the hundreds of people, I would guess, over 12 years. Some of the folks that have struggled the most are people that come in with really strong religious convictions, because they're so convicted in their beliefs that they don't open their mind to any new concepts, and not necessarily new concepts, but maybe ways to apply the concepts they already have.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'll be straightforward with you, and again, hopefully not taking a bad taste. I'm not throwing stones, because this isn't always the case, but some of the sponsees that have had the hardest time staying sober are the ones that are super Christian.
Yeah.
I've seen it be an asset, but I've also seen it be a liability. The big book talks about that too. I wanted to point it out, like, this stuff that I'm saying is literally out of the big book. There's a line in there that says, while his religious convictions were very good, they did not spell the necessary vital spiritual experience.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people that try and get sober just in the church. And people do. I mean, we got to say that. People can go to the church and get sober through the church, and absolutely. But, we've seen a lot of people that, for whatever reason, are closed off to any sort of program, be it 12-step program, for whatever reason, and want to do it just inside of the confines of the church. And a lot of times they end up in the rooms and they see what, in this case, Alcoholics Anonymous has to offer that the church doesn't, and I'm a Christian. I came in as a Christian. I can totally understand. Now, I wasn't a super practicing Christian, but I believe in Jesus Christ and the whole deal. And, so these first two steps for me weren't very, we'll keep it on the second step. Second step for me wasn't very difficult at all, because I had a concept of a higher power and I didn't allow it to get in the way of my experience with Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think if everybody could adopt that, we'd be in a much better place. But for whatever reason, sometimes people put blinders on and don't want to explore other avenues. But you see it inside the rooms too. I mean, there's people inside the rooms that say you don't need a therapist. All you need is a sponsor. If you have a sponsor, you don't need to see a therapist, or you don't need to see a psychiatrist, or this or that, or you don't really need to go to. I've witnessed this from people.
I've witnessed it too. And again, this is where the context is so important, because while this part isn't in the table of contents, it says on page 133 of the big book, God has provided this world with many fine doctors, psychiatrists, and medical professionals. Many give freely of themselves. Yeah. Nowadays, you have to have insurance or cash, but back then they were doing a lot of free voluntary work. But point is like the people, whether it's in 12-step programs, a church, what kept me, my sponsor asked me this. He's like, Ben, what kept you out of church? Was it the message of God, or was it the people?
Or was it the tithing plate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll encourage people to do, I know you tried to end a couple minutes ago, but I get excited about this. At the end of the day, we need a personality change sufficient to overcome our alcoholism. And I truly believe going through these steps, even the second step, the personality change you receive there, the piece of it is the open-mindedness and willingness. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And if you're willing to grow and learn, that is plenty to stay sober. It's the people whose minds snap shut against theories that don't stay sober.
Yeah.
Stay narrow-minded and in your own little box, and that's what got you there to begin with. You don't have to believe what I believe. You don't have to believe what Tom believes. And that's what's beautiful about it, is you go through these steps and you can have your own beliefs and own interpretations and find what works for you.
Yeah. And the only thing I'll add to that is, and I know we touched on this the last episode, these steps are in order for a reason. So in the first step, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. And then the second step is, what is it?
Dude, you put me on the spot. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
Hang on, let's do a cut so we don't look
That's
like
embarrassing.
Hang on. Yeah, so the only other thing I'll add to that is these steps are put in order for a reason. You know, the first step is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. And the second step came to believe that a higher power could restore us to sanity. Mm-hmm. You know, so as we go through these steps, you'll start to see you can't go from step 1 to step 6 to step 8 to step 3. You have to go in order. So this is just really, now we're just starting to kick off. The first one we admitted, and Russell Brand does a very good job at breaking this down for, you know, people that need to have a very, you know, basic understanding. But the first step essentially is that we're effed. We've screwed up our lives. And the second step is, could there be something out there that could un-F us? And we understand we are not that person. You know, it could be the group of drunks that are inside the rooms or whatever the case is. There's something out there. I believe that there's something out there that could help me get back to some level of normalcy. And I think that's it, you know, as far as step 1 and step 2. And then as we go on, you'll start to see the progression in how this is a total life change, and it has extremely very little to do with drugs and alcohol. I mean, there's only one step that the word alcohol is even mentioned in.
I'm really glad you brought up Russell Brand. I highly recommend, if you struggle with these concepts, like Tom was saying, get Russell Brand's book on the 12 steps. It's his interpretation of it, so to speak. And
what's it called? Is it called Recover?
Dude, I'm drawing a blank. I've only read it once.
Go ahead, do your thing, and I'll.
But yeah, Tom summed it up. I'm gonna go ahead and curse Tom. You can bleep it out if you want.
Okay.
But Russell Brand broke down the first 3 steps like this. Step 1, you're fucked. Step 2, could this be unfucked? Step 3, can you unfuck it by yourself?
Yeah.
So chances are, and this is just my opinion, if you've landed yourself in a treatment center, you landed yourself in a 12-step room, in a way, don't get me wrong, there's a lot more knowledge to be acquired and a lot more experience to be acquired, but you've kind of already done the first 3 steps. Things were bad enough that you sought out treatment or went to a 12-step room or the like.
Mm-hmm.
And you had some kind of hope that things would get better. Otherwise, you would have just gone on to the bitter end, drinking and drugging until you were dead. So step 2 was done there. And step 3, you decided you couldn't do it by yourself, so you showed up to said places to be with other people that may be able to show you the options for a solution to your problem.
Yeah, and the book itself is called Recovery, Freedom from Our Addictions, Russell Brand. And I'll put it here in the video so you can see it. And you can order it on Amazon. It's a really good book. There's even an audio version of it too, which is, I think, kind of funny too, because, you know, Russell Brand is a comedian. So, you know, hearing the audio version of it it's kind of like a stand-up.
He does his own audio on it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah, it's hard to understand, but, you know. So anyways, all right, Ben, well, that's it. Good job on that. And that was step 2. So thank you for tuning in to the podcast. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you could always email us, Tom at realrecoverytalk.com and Ben at realrecoverytalk.com. Now, here's the thing with these aren't going to be coming out in chronological order. So I'm going to label them as they come out in the podcast, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. But we're not going to do all 12 steps right in a row. So just watch out for the next step whenever it comes out. We'll probably do one a week. And as you know, this comes out on Wednesdays and Sundays. So one of those 2 days, in theory, right now, we'll release one step a week. I don't know if it's going to be Wednesdays or Sundays, but you're avid listeners and you listen all the time anyway, so you won't miss it. And that's it, Ben. Anything else?
No, that was fun.
Oh, we got to remember, we're trying to help you turn your mess into your message. All right. That's it.
All right.
We'll see you later.